For every shipwreck I've talked about, and for every shipwreck you've heard about, there's probably over 100 you haven't. Sometimes the craziest, most dramatic story can become the most obscure. Now, I have read many shipwreck stories on my channel, but I don't know if I've read one that was like this. I don't think I've read one where a ship was not only cursed with just bad luck, like this one seems to have been, she never had a chance. But she was also battered hard. I don't think I've read a story on a ship battered as hard as this one was, with large waves that washed away her crew, never to be seen again, all sparked by a cruel act of just unlucky misfortune that followed them, steering her towards a light they thought was their salvation, only for it to prove to be their nightmare. And there was also an incredibly valiant effort to save those on board that followed the initial calamity. This is the forgotten story of the wreck of the Irex. A ship doomed by constant misfortunes, an unlucky chance, and then a ship that was battered, beaten, and run aground on her maiden voyage. Destroyed before even getting to live a life. Irex's owner was J.D. Clink at Greenock, Scotland, and her builder was J. Reed and Company at Port Glasgow, Scotland. Her yard number was 8L. She was launched on October 10th, 1889, and completed that December. She was a steel-hulled, three-masted, fully rigged sailing ship. She was 302 feet long, her beam was 43 feet, and she was registered as 2,348 gross registered tons. The stunning vessel set off on what should have been a glorious maiden voyage on Christmas Eve, 1889, under the command of Captain Hutton, with a crew of 34, plus 2 stowaways, and carrying inside her hold a cargo of iron sewage pipes. Things went wrong from the beginning. Storms had delayed her initial departure date of December 10th, and that was perhaps a sign of what was to come. An ominous sign that she should have waited. But it was like Mother Nature herself was against her making the crossing. Irex just couldn't get out. Storms hit again on Christmas Eve, and she was forced to shelter in Belfast Loch. Once again, it was like a sign that she should have turned back, but on January 1st, 1890, she attempted her maiden voyage to Rio de Janeiro, and this time, she was caught again, in a hurricane-force winds, too. She was forced to make an attempt to take shelter in Farmouth, a town in Cornwall, on the 24th, but there was no pilot to guide her in up the channel, so she carried on blindly, and out of all of this, this is where the worst stroke of all the bad luck she'd been dealt already was given to her. As Irex neared Needles, her captain spotted a light. In the hurricane-force winds battering the ship and her sails, it must have seemed like a godsend. He thought it was a pilot ship that had come to meet them, and he made for it, thinking it would guide him and his crew and their ship in safely. It wasn't a pilot ship light. It was the light from the Needles Lighthouse. At about 10 p.m. on January 25th, 1890, Irex plowed through the waves in the dark and was driven into the shallow water by them and stranded. As she was driven onto the shore, she became stuck and was the punching bag for large waves that smashed into her hull over and over, breaking over the ship, damaging her structure, and, according to one survivor, washing away the captain, the first mate, the boatswain, and an unknown crewman. None of them were ever seen again. The rest of her crew survived on their battered ship, being beaten by the harsh waves over and over until 9 a.m. the next morning, when soldiers stationed at the Needles batteries spotted them and immediately alerted the Tolan lifeboat. The steamer Hampshire also arrived to aid the grounded ship, but neither could get close before noon that day. The waves, however, were not finished with their assault. Again, it was like Mother Nature itself was just adamantly against the Irex in every way, including any rescue attempt. The lifeboat was nearly driven into the Hampshire, and they both abandoned the attempt to save Irex's crew. The Coast Guard then made another attempt shortly after 1 p.m. They fired a rocket with a line on it from a battery on shore, positioned at the top of a cliff 400 feet above the ship, which did catch in the ship's rigging. Irex's crew tried to reach the line, and a man fell to his death. But the hawser was secured a little over 2 hours later, and the 29 survivors of the Irex were taken from their beaten, battered ship and saved, lifted up the 400-foot cliff face by a mix of soldiers, Coast Guard personnel, and civilians. Irex was then left, grounded, stricken, and abandoned to the harsh surf. The ship's log, which would have likely held the answers to questions about who did what and what actions were committed that no one who survived could ever resolve, was never found. Her crew was taken to Queen Victoria herself and congratulated for their bravery in the face of what they faced, which was almost certain death. And the survivors weren't alone. They were joined by those who had saved them, who were also honored. A newspaper from the time wrote, "Bravery recognized. By order of the Queen, the officers and men of the Coast Guard, and a certain number of the officers, non-commissioned officers and men of the Royal Artillery, who took part in saving the lives of 26 of the crew of the Irex," interjection by me here, this says 26, I read 29, I'm not exactly sure what the number was, "wrecked near Needles on the night of the 25th, were taken to Osborne on Sunday afternoon, and were seen by her." Irex should have had a glorious and lucrative career, but it was clearly not meant to be. It really is just like everything was against this ship from ever leaving. Today, what is left of the Irex consists of a rusting hull, remains of her cargo that wasn't later taken out, resting at a depth of 6 meters, roughly 200 yards, off the beach at Needles Point on the Isle of Wight, which if you've been around for a while, you'll know that seems to be almost a hotspot for shipwrecks. We talked about the Eurydice there a while back. I wish there were first-hand accounts from survivors about what they experienced, but I couldn't find any. But I'd love to read them if I could ever track them down. And I absolutely would do a part 2 if I can ever find any, so I can share them here. Because with the lack of details, there's not much to tell with this story. But with what they went through, I feel like there is more to tell. Perhaps one day, history will relent and give up a couple of these secrets, so we can get an even better understanding of what happened on the Irex.